Well, you
Have a
ready to
great
move
day,
on,
guys.
sir?
We'll see you
Yes,
later.
sir.
Okay.
So,
Introduce.
so we're going to bring on our friend General Blaine,
Yep.
Brigadier
The
General Blaine
brigadier.
Holt,
Yep. The brigadier
otherwise
general.
known as Blaino, longtime friend. He a few years ago helped us bring General Petraeus when we first honored
Right.
General
Right. I
Petraeus,
remember that.
and yeah, he was decorated by him in Afghanistan,
Right.
their friends, etc. And the company he was with, they gave us a jet to bring General Petraeus here. Since that time, we've built this really wonderful relationship with General Petraeus. He's hosted several of our events.
Right.
He is a past recipient of the Magellas, and he will help present it to General Dunford next. So
Awesome.
this is
No.
a long history with the two
No,
of them,
it's-
and we're really excited.
Well, it's always good to have General Petraeus here. Really, he lends so much credibility to everything that we continue to do. So that's wonderful. Let me tell you something about Blaine Holt, the Brigadier General. He's the CEO of Alchemy, and this is an AI machine learning and network data science company that enables enterprises to preempt supply chain risk. Now, Blaine is a longtime entrepreneur, future-focused business leader focusing on innovative ways to solve pressing business challenges. Wouldn't we all like to be a part of that? And after serving our nation for over a quarter of a century, 27 years to be exact, Blaine Holt retired as a brigadier general, and his last Air Force assignment was the deputy U.S. military representative to NATO. So quite a resume indeed.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Blaine Holt, and I am really honored and proud to be sitting alongside of General Petraeus. And thank you very much right up front to America's Future Series, David Hamilton, Michelle Pearson, for putting this discussion together. I'm a retired one-star general, and much of the reason that is true is because of the man that I'm here with today. General Petraeus and I worked together on issues in Central Asia and Afghanistan, and I was honored to be one of his commanders in Kyrgyzstan, fighting the fight, leading the way to get logistic support to General McChrystal, and the mentorship that came with my relationship to General Petraeus really set my path going forward, and I continue to learn a lot today. So I just want to say good morning to everybody, and good morning to you, General Petraeus. How are you this morning?
Couldn't be better, Blaine. Great to see you. All the better for having seen you, in fact.
Thank you, sir. It's great to see you too. And here we are in business with you at KKR, myself as a startup CEO of a tech firm. But I think what we've seen this summer might be a great time to reconnoiter and come back and maybe reflect on what we saw in Afghanistan and the wars that we've fought over these years, and then maybe try to project forward what we see coming on the security menu for our diplomats and our military leaders.
Sure.
So with that, I'll get started. First question, I want to go back to when you were recently retired and you started a reflection series, which I thought was very valuable, especially for junior officers who were learning their craft. 5 years ago at Harvard's Belfer Center, you and the team there captured key observations from your experiences as the commander of Central Command, followed by MNF ISAF. You stressed the importance of conditions being achieved to transition full control to the lawfully elected Afghan government and its military. But sir, as you reflect back on that effort at Harvard, how would you characterize the conclusions you reached then in contrast with what we actually witnessed this summer?
Well, what we did at Harvard when I was a fellow there for some 6 years at the Belfer Center was one of the projects was to capture and distill some of my thinking on strategic leadership, which is really different. That's the leadership at the very top of an enterprise. It's the commander of the surge in Iraq, which of course I was privileged to do at Central Command, say in Afghanistan, where you have to perform 4 tasks properly to succeed. You have to get the big ideas right. You do that certainly with all of your workforce, if you will, all your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. You want it to be as inclusive and so forth. It's iterative, it's open, it's transparent, but you have to get those big ideas right. You have to get the strategy right. You then have to communicate that through the breadth and depth of the organization. You have to then oversee the implementation of it. You have to drive the campaign plan. That's what we normally think of as leadership. It's the example, the energy, the how you spend your time, the hiring, the firing, the rewarding, the incentivization, the metrics, all of this again. And then you have to also perform a 4th task that's sometimes overlooked, which is to sit down and determine how you need to refine the big idea so you can do it again and again and again and stay ahead of the competition, the enemy, whoever it is that is, again, chasing you around on a battlefield or in a particular industry or economic area. And what we sought to do in Afghanistan and the other endeavors that I was privileged to lead was indeed to get the big ideas right. I should note that in the case of Afghanistan, it took us nearly 9 years just to get the inputs right, because of course we diverted our attention very, very quickly after taking down the Taliban regime and then started to focus on Iraq. And as Admiral Mullen used to say, as you'll recall, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. So it took us quite a long time to finally get the right organizational architecture, the right strategy, the right leaders in place, the right preparation of our forces, equipment, units, and all the rest of that, and the right level roughly of resources, and not just military, but also diplomats, development workers, intelligence officers, funding, and so forth. And we had that right really for a relatively brief period of time, because of course we had to start drawing down in the summer of 2011, having gotten the inputs right for the first time roughly in late 2010. A lot of that the result of the great work done by General Stan McChrystal when I was at Central Command. And then of course I replaced him and continued that work and added a few new endeavors. One of those was indeed the idea of how to transition tasks from our forces to Afghan forces, from our diplomats and other elements to Afghan institutions. And so those who say, by the way, that it all went wrong when we started nation building, forget that you have to build forces and structures and institutions, or you can't hand them off to someone, however imperfect they may be. And that was true really certainly to the end of that regime. But they were certainly, in my mind, they were certainly much better than what has taken over. What happened, frankly, in the end in Afghanistan is that instead of concluding that we had achieved what might have been termed a sustained commitment, in which sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure, and we'd reduced our forces quite considerably. Would the Taliban have started to fight again? Yeah, I suspect so, but we had a lot of enablers. We actually had very good Afghan partners, especially those in the commandos and the reinforcements that would be provided by the Afghan Air Force, and then augmented with our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and precision strike assets. But instead of sustaining that and just saying, look, we can't win this war, which is one of the realities of it, if the enemy has sanctuary in another country, which again is the case. The Taliban headquarters, of course, the reason they call it the Quetta Shur is because it's located near Quetta, the capital of Balochistan province of Pakistan, and the other major element, the Haqqani Taliban, the Peshawar Shura, again, also in Pakistan. So that's sort of the context in which this took place. And as my great diplomatic partner during the surge in Iraq, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, put it, I think, very aptly, we just, in a sense, lost strategic patience. We just weren't willing to continue to commit with no real clear, end date in sight. There was no way that someone could say, if we just spend 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, finally, we will have achieved what it is that we set out to do, and the government will be sufficiently robust that forces will be adequate to handle their own security. Rather, it would have been quite an open-ended. So one can understand, again, if you will, the frustration. One can understand the maddening aspects of the sense of inadequacies, imperfections, certainly in the Afghan government, which occasionally made the situation difficult, to be sure. But from my perspective, what did result is heartbreaking. Yeah. It is tragic. And frankly, I think it's pretty disastrous. And we're not going to see Afghanistan leave our rearview mirrors. This is a looming humanitarian catastrophe. There is all kinds of internal strife that is starting to develop within the Taliban leaders, the Haqqani versus the Afghan Taliban. There are resistance forces that are gradually coming together. There are extremist elements that have been making life very, very difficult, bombing Shia mosques. These are Sunni extremist forces trying to again, ignite what they tried to do in Iraq as well, which is to ignite a Sunni Shia civil war, differences between the Hazara Shia and say the Pashto. And then also, in fact, today, I think they attacked the Afghan military hospital in Kabul, quite a devastating attack, not to mention the 13 men and women in uniform that we lost at the entry control point, and nearly 200 Afghan civilians. So again, that's, I think, how to cast this. We sort of thought we had the big ideas right. We had conditions, the view of, I think, military understandably wants to take tasks to move forward based on conditions having been met, and then you can transition tasks to, again, host nation forces. And that's how it did proceed for a good couple of years or a bit longer than that after I was privileged to command in Afghanistan. But then over time, the impatience, the frustration, the various maddening aspects of Afghanistan just eventually led us to say that, as I said, this is just no longer worth continuing, except that, again, the outcome, I think, is so tragic and sad and frankly disastrous that you have an organization that is trying to take Afghanistan back to the 7th century as they ruled in the past in the 1990s. So again, not at all by any means, obviously, a happy outcome, and unfortunately, one that is going to be quite catastrophic this winter, given that the harvest this past year in Afghanistan was the poorest in about 35 years. They had a terrible drought. Their assets are frozen around the world. They have no access to the IMF or World Bank funds. And it's pretty clear that no other country is going to provide the 75% of the budget that the US, Japan, UK, and a handful of others used to provide for them. So it's a very, very bleak prospect. It's not surprising that many Afghans have already left, indeed, probably way beyond hundreds of thousands, and that many more are trying to leave. And the refugee outflow, the challenges that this winter is going to bring are going to be very profound. And we will have to ultimately, together with the rest of the world, figure out how it is that we're literally going to keep people from starving and freezing while not reinforcing Taliban rule as we do that, which is not easy.
Right. So if we looked at Afghanistan as like a big boulder of sorts, and we drop it into a pond, there's ripples everywhere. And that gets us to the geostrategic plates around the world. So, this impact of how it went this summer has got to affect the geopolitical environment. So how do you
Sure.
now view the security environment for the US, its partners, and its allies?
Well, first of all, what this has done as well is I think it gives China an opportunity to say, see, we told you the US is a declining power, and we told you that the US is not a dependable partner. And so it's incumbent on us, in fact, to prove that that is incorrect. And I think, to be fair to the administration, there's been a flurry of activity in recent months, but especially in recent weeks. And of course, the president just was at the G20, and America is back now at the climate summit in Glasgow and so forth, showing that the US is engaged, it is a world leader, and all the rest of this. But again, this is not going to be easy. I've spent 3 of the last 4 weeks in Europe. It's pretty clear that the withdrawal from Afghanistan bruised some of the relationships that we have there, very important relationships with our most prominent NATO allies, most of whom wanted to stay, felt inadequately consulted. And of course, that was added to a bit because of this AUKUS agreement, the Australia, UK, US agreement on nuclear powered submarines that replaces the agreement that Australia had with France having felt completely blindsided and withdrawing its ambassador, for the first time. And this is the longest standing ally we had it not been for the French during the Revolutionary War and defeated the fleet off Yorktown. who knows whether we would have prevailed. It certainly would have taken a bit longer. But so you have these dynamics out there. And again, it's incumbent on the administration and frankly, those in Washington writ large to show that our country does work, that we can achieve things, that we can indeed continue to lead around the world. And even as we are, again, very clearly returning to organizations and so forth that we left during the last administration, going back to the WHO, back to the Paris Climate Accord, trying to get back to the Iran nuclear deal, and engaged in a variety of other ways. And all of that, of course, really is in the global context of what is the most important relationship in the world, which is that between the US and its partners and allies and China, trying to make that relationship as mutually beneficial as is possible, while recognizing that there are clearly areas of competition, very, very significant competition, and trying to minimize the chances for mistakes, missteps, miscalculations, misperceptions. Keep in mind that, of course, what we want to do there is to deter conflict above all. Deterrence is a function of essentially two factors. It's the potential adversary's perception of your capabilities, and we're doing a lot to build up our capabilities in the Indo-Pacific and to work with others in so doing, and the adversary's perception of your will, your willingness to employ those capabilities as needed. And so when you have something like Afghanistan, or indeed, some years back, a red line that turns out not to be a red line, that can call into question that will component that is so essential to deterrence. And again, it's therefore incumbent on us, if we're honest with ourselves, and clearly we should be, that we have to demonstrate that we have the will and not just the capabilities, even as we're also working hard to augment those capabilities. Let me sketch what really, the United States uniquely has to keep a lot of plates spinning, to use that image of the guy in the circus who puts a plate on a stick and gets it spinning, and then he goes over, does another one, comes back, keeps this, and eventually you have a tent full of plates that are spinning. Some of those plates are much more important than others, but generally you can't let these plates drop because there are consequences for doing that. The China plate, again, the one that represents the US and its coalition and partners relationship with China, is probably bigger than all the other plates together. So that does indicate the importance, the primacy of that particular plate and issue. But there's lots of other plates. There's a North Korea plate. There is an Iran plate that is actually increasingly urgent. That could be the next big potential flashpoint. There's in Iraq, Syria, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, affiliates of those in Africa. Again, there's lots of other plates. There's a Russia plate. There's a cyber threat plate. Again, it all goes on. We have to keep all those plates spinning. Again, we want to do it together with allies and partners to the greatest extent possible. And indeed, in many cases, we want to be the force that provides advice and assistance, training and equipping and enabling, but not frontline forces. And we've actually worked out how to do that and done that pretty successfully, I think, in Iraq and Syria, where it was host nation forces and partners that did the frontline fighting, while we provided, again, drones and precision strike advice and assistance, training and equipping, but not those on the front lines. That armada of drones that we can put up now has really transformed, therefore, how it is that we can try to achieve our objectives in such cases.
So you see, I would argue that the biggest plate now in the room, especially post-Afghanistan, with some of the events that we've seen, is the China plate. Clearly everything is—
No question. Yeah, as I said, that plate is bigger than all the others put together. But by the way, I should note, there is still an Afghanistan plate, and it has several features. One is the potential for the Islamic State to develop a real capability that could threaten beyond just the borders of Afghanistan. They're already making life very miserable inside Afghanistan. You're already seeing, in fact, the Taliban are realizing that it's much harder to be the counterinsurgent, to be the government, to have to provide basic services and and run an economy and all the other responsibilities of actually governing a country that was 40 million people with limited infrastructure. It's a lot harder than being the insurgents who just hang out in the hills and attack when they want to and then go back after making life and killing often, sadly, innocent civilians. So clearly that plate is still there. There's also a humanitarian aspect to that, as I mentioned earlier. There are other components to that as well. And that plate is not going away. I think the idea that, well, we could withdraw from here and that allows us to focus more over there. We don't need to focus on this anymore. I think that's going to prove inaccurate.
I agree. And it's also in the orbit of One Belt, One Road and all of the Chinese strategic initiatives flowing in that direction. So the geopolitical linkage is very much in place for that.
It is, although I would be careful to, the idea that China will step in and replace the United States, I think is not correct. I think China will be cautious. You may recall that China had a copper mine that put, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars into it just south of Kabul, but ultimately withdrew from it after, in fact, I think it was the Taliban or Haqqani who shot some mortars and rockets at it. So again, I think they will be cautious. It's not in their model to give large sums of money. Rather, they tend to loan money to a country to do infrastructure that country wants, and also perhaps China may want because it gives them access to strategic minerals or something like that. But again, this is really hard in Afghanistan. And again, we're seeing the kind of violence that has scared off investors in the past. I mean, it used to be described that Afghanistan was not venture capital. It was adventure capital. I mean, if you want an venture in investing, try to do that in Afghanistan. Sure. So again, I think Afghanistan just faces enormous challenges, and that will keep it, sadly, a plate that we have to keep spinning. It's not going to spin of its own capabilities, and it's going to be very challenging for the world.
Absolutely. So circling back to China, when I was in, I had finished my military fellowship at CFR, I was participating with Secretary Kissinger, Ambassador Win Lord on dialogues with the Chinese. And I think a lot of the things that we took back then in 2010 was China had exhibited an increased level of assertiveness on the world stage, which I would argue today has become outright aggressiveness. As evidenced by things that we see, like with the Taiwan flybys and force demonstrations, the hypersonic missile tests. They seem to be much more active in many operational domains, to include cyber, economic. Should we think of China today as more of a global competitor or an outright adversary? How would you characterize their strategic intent? Something we always tried to get at least a decade and a half ago.
Well, very difficult to assess, obviously. You're trying to get, as always, inside the minds, in a sense, of key leaders, and obviously of one key leader in particular who it appears is going to have an unprecedented third term as president, party leader, and head of the military. And certainly some of the assertiveness is perhaps traditional. It is the second superpower, if you will. And certainly, I think we have to be careful not to push it into areas of competition that aren't necessary. One of the areas that individuals are looking at closely right now is whether or not you can actually separate those areas of cooperation, say climate, pandemic, global economy, and so forth, from areas of competition. And so therefore cooperate where you can, compete where you must. Again, noting that some of that competition is, again, very, very understandable for a country that has achieved in 43 years truly unprecedented economic growth, but certainly faces a number of challenges now as well, with the growth slowing, the demographic downturn that is really quite substantial. Various sectors in which there are challenges. The Evergrande real estate development company has the largest debt of any real estate company in the world, and others in that same space that also have significant levels of indebtedness. Again, lots of challenges there as well. I think you just have to, in the military, you always sort of inevitably at some point you have to take a bit of a worst case. What is the most challenging possible course of action that could be pursued, and you do have to, I think, work against that while also trying to avoid being, in a sense, needlessly provocative.
Sure.
Or taking some action that could be misconstrued or perceived in the wrong manner. This is difficult because, of course, number one, you just have a change of administration still in the United States. At the very top level, the numbers of conversation are still less than the fingers on one hand. There will be more certainly to come. There are slight signs periodically where there might be some progress, perhaps in some of the trade areas and so forth. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's still certainly the current relationship, because of the U.S. change and the fact we don't even have an ambassador there yet. Hopefully Nick Burns will be confirmed soon, an extraordinary diplomat, as you know. Yes. But this is a relationship still very much evolving with this administration, even as, again, President Xi does, in a sense, pursue essentially re-election and takes various actions in the pursuit of that. Again, the idea that he feels so confident that he doesn't need to do this, I think, would be inaccurate as well. Mm-hmm. So this is a very, very complicated relationship. It is the most consequential in the world. Mm-hmm. It is not remotely like the old Cold War because of the enormous amount of economic interaction. People will point out, well, China controls these minerals and they have this or that. Well, yes, but we have other elements that they need, and so there's a mutual relationship here, dependence actually, right. That is very, very significant. And the idea that China would cut this off or the U.S. would cut that off probably is not accurate in many cases because of the consequences for the country that might take that action. Right. The assertiveness is concerning, certainly in a number of countries in the region, a number of the activities that have been pursued. And again, our objective has to be, together with the like-minded countries around the world, together with our allies and partners, to try to the extent that we can to influence decisions and behavior and so forth, to avoid, again, something that could lead to the kind of conflict that, say, Graham Allison's examination of the so-called Thucydides trap, where Thucydides described you had an established power, Sparta, the US, you have a rising power, China, Athens, and as Thucydides wrote, inevitably they went to war. This cannot be the outcome in this case, certainly not in a nuclear era, and the potential for destruction that could be so vast. So again, that all comes back once again to, in essence, the most important plate, the bigger plate than all the others put together, and how absolutely imperative it is that the U.S., together with its allies and partners, forge the kind of approach that can avoid mistakes, missteps, misperceptions, and conflict.
So to reach out, just to finish this up, to reach out to the other plates, given that China's meteoric trajectory is so visible, we focus on it so intensely on this very complex relationship. It's very easy, not for the Pentagon, but it's very easy for the rest of us to look away from threats that are posed by others, such as Russia, North Korea, transnational threats, Iran. And we've got renewed concerns, like you said, that Afghanistan's going to be a power projection platform eventually. So how do we formulate a strategy that engenders renewed commitment from allies and partners to deter these threats?
Well, deter, to deal with, to respond to, and so forth. Again, what you always want to do is try to do it with partners and allies. You also want to try to do what we generally have successfully been doing to counter or to deal with many of the, say, the extremist threats, where I think we should have learned by now, you have to keep an eye and pressure on extremists. And even if you can't have the kind of comprehensive civil military campaign that can actually resolve the reasons why people are attracted to extremist thinking and activities, at the very least, you can degrade and disrupt those capabilities so at least they can't, again, visit violence in the countries of our allies and in our homeland. And again, we've generally done that pretty well. One of the great accomplishments of the last 20 years is that there has not been another 9/11 attack. In fact, there have been very, very small numbers of Americans killed at home and by Islamist extremists. I think it's approximately 100. Many other categories that are more significant than that. So again, you want to do the kinds of approach where we're providing training, equipping, advising, and assisting and enablers, not those on the front lines, so that you can have sustainable approaches. That's true of the kinds of threats I've described here. Say Russia, on the other hand, well, you've got to have deployments in the Baltic states. You've got to keep pushing NATO capabilities out, into Eastern Poland and so forth. All of that ongoing and continued from the Obama through the Trump and into the present administration. Again, North Korea, a problem of its own, for which there's a response and a formulation which is generally going to achieve unsatisfactory results, which you just then have to deal with. There's no clearly, the previous administration tried direct meetings and so forth at the highest level, and that wasn't successful. It's not clear at all in my mind that a North Korean leader would give up the capabilities that he basically starved his country to achieve. So again, each one of these you're going to have to work around and determine how is it that you can achieve your objectives. But all of it, again, in that global context where the most important and overarching endeavor has to be that which does relate to China. And noting that there's a bit of systemic competition here. Because the Chinese system is a different one from ours, but it has achieved extraordinary economic growth and pulled hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty just in the last, again, 43 years or so since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China. So, that's that global context. That's, I think, why this sort of plate spinning analogy or metaphor or what have you description, I think, does capture what the U.S. uniquely has to do. Right. But of course, there's more. There's also the domestic issues, and I think rightly, the current administration in the U.S. has asserted that more than ever before, foreign policy begins at home. That we have to combat the pandemic and doing reasonably well with that. Obviously, the Delta was a setback, but just gradually grinding away, getting more people vaccinated, higher percentages, convincing those to, again, get the shot and so forth. And that the numbers coming down reassuringly, getting the economy going again. Our sense is that the fourth quarter results are going to be very, very substantial. Then coming together in Washington, getting some of these legislative issues resolved and investing in infrastructure and other areas that will produce the kind of productivity gains that are so important for our country's economy, and indeed even trying to bring the country back together a bit after a period that has featured some, to say that there has been partisanship or even intense partisanship, I'm not sure would completely capture the reality. So certainly the domestic issues deserve enormous attention, and certainly that's what the administration seems to be trying to do. And I just note before we bring this to an end for the watchers that I am truly non-political. Don't register, don't vote, don't contribute, don't endorse candidates, which gives me the luxury of assessing either party, I'd like to think, fairly realistically.
Yes, sir. Well, I will say that after many years of being your student, it's conversations like this that are really enriching. They're tremendous value, especially, I will say, to me personally. I know our viewers today will benefit, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that and America Future series for putting this together. It's always a joy to spend some time with you, sir. And
Pleasure's mine.
any final thoughts? But I will leave it to you for the last word.
Well, look, it's from the days when I was a 4-star and you were a colonel there in Kyrgyzstan at the Manas Transit Center, and leading that effort very, very impressively. It's just been a joy to watch your trajectory, to see all that you did after that, your selection for promotion to the ranks of general officers, and frankly, to see what you've done in your post-government time, where your affinity for entrepreneurship, innovation, and so forth has been very impressive. As someone who's not only a partner in a global investment firm that invested in large companies, but who individually is invested in some 20 or so startups, I think it's such an exciting arena, and it is great to see what you're doing in it, and to see the prospects for the future for you and really for our country. It is this kind of innovation, the entrepreneurship, and the conditions that allow it to flourish in our country that have time and time again made our country great again. And it is doing that yet again right now. But we do need to invest in our future, and conversations like this hopefully will convince folks, if you will, that it is worth doing. Just as we invest in each individual, that we do invest in the country's infrastructure as a whole, that we invest in a whole host of different areas that can, over time, continue to allow our country to lead around the world.
Thank you so much, sir. Humbled here by your words.
Pleasure.
Great, and thank you very much, AFS. We're a close here.
Yeah.
Great conversation from General Holt and General Petraeus, and we thank them both very, very, very much, certainly for their service, but for the great conversation that we just shared with you all. As we continue on with our America's Future Series, National Security, Cyber, Land, Air, Sea, and Space Symposium. Scott Murray, along with David Hamilton. What'd you think? That was pretty good stuff, wasn't it?
So, both the generals are both very gracious, but they're also very, I think they're very clear. We have some very significant threats from China that we need to deal with. The threat of China is not coming; it's already here, and they have surpassed us in many, many ways.
Right.
The supply chain issues that we're facing is one of them. There are a dozen. We have to get very, very serious about this, and we can't keep pushing it off and thinking in our mind, oh, there's something we ought to deal with, and we have to deal with it now. We need to protect our IP. We need to stop their incursions in the South China Sea. It's real. It's here. It's a present danger. I hope that conversation is a wake-up call for that, and then a host of other things that they covered. Anyway, and the one last thing I want to say before Veterans Day is the 20 years that Afghanistan was secure, wasn't exporting terrorism, as the general mentioned, where women and minorities had decent lives, are all valuable. So that service and that sacrifice was not wasted, et cetera. They have not been exporting terrorism, et cetera. And so I know they fought for each other on the left and the right. I get that. And
Right.
There's a great deal of value in knowing that. But also they made a difference in the world. So I want to thank our veterans who fought in Afghanistan and protected us there.
Absolutely.
For that.
Absolutely. Totally agree, David. Totally agree.